Our final perspective is from Andrew Goddard. Andrew's got a portfolio ministry which combines parish ministry with teaching and research, and he currently teaches Christian ethics for the Westminster Theological Centre and the Cambridge Theological Federation. And Andrew's going to give us 20 minutes looking at theological and ethical perspectives on bullying. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Rona, and thank you all those who've been involved in organising today, which I hope will enable the Church of England to respond much more seriously to the problem of bullying, particularly in church contexts. I've been asked, as Rona just said, to offer some theological and ethical perspectives. I think I've been asked, as I've taught Christian ethics within theological education, but perhaps also because in the past I, along with others, have experienced bullying behaviour and a failure of Christians with oversight to address it. What follows is obviously only going to be able to be exploratory, flagging themes, raising questions, highlighting areas to explore, but I hope it might prove helpful. I'm going to open with how to think ethically in relation to bullying and then offer more explicitly theological reflections. If it's worked and you have access to chat, you may be able to click and open a file which gives you a rough outline structure of where we're going over the next 20 minutes. Most people who've studied ethics have been introduced to the idea of different approaches to ethics, where perhaps the most common categorization is a threefold one. There are deontological approaches focused on rules and obligations, consequentialist approaches concerned about outcomes or consequences, and virtue approaches concerned about character and habits and patterns of life. Now, I have doubts about this schema, but it does point to three elements which need to be considered in any ethical thinking, or three lenses, if you like, through which to consider ethical questions. First, we need to think about the nature or structure of our actions and how we act. This involves thinking about patterns or structures of actions that can be identified and named and morally evaluated, often by formulating moral rules or laws to guide us and enable moral judgments. Secondly, we need to think about actions' consequences. These will also shape our decisions about how to act and how we evaluate our own and others' past actions. But we need also to think thirdly about actors or agents, considering the sort of people we are and we want to become, the sort of cultures and communities we inhabit and want to develop, their ethos, their patterns of moral formation or deformation. And I want to begin with some thoughts on bullying and ethics in relation to each of these three different elements. The first area of ethical reflection concerns how to define, categorize, and evaluate actions. Now, in one sense, of course, every single action is unique, but moral and legal reflection involves identifying, classifying, and naming patterns of action and offering judgment on whether these are to be commended or condemned. And bullying is one such classification. I want to highlight 5 areas by suggesting that there are 2 elements to bullying which, while not unique, are importantly distinctive, and then noting 3 issues raised by focusing on the nature of the act. Firstly, bullying is a classification and terminology which now has a negative moral judgment tied to it, either by definition or consensus. Often our ethical debates are about whether some action is right or wrong: abortion, euthanasia, war, divorce. We agree on what sort of behaviour it is that we are talking about, but disagree about whether it is right or wrong, about whether or when such action might be justified. But other ethical categories are ones where the terminology itself builds in the moral judgment, or there is near universal agreement that what it refers to is wrong: injustice, sexual abuse, genocide. And bullying is in this latter category. There are few, if any, people willing to defend bullying as such, or to try and present a case for justified bullying. The defence instead is that what happened is not bullying. This explains why bullying is what Yes Prime Minister referred to as an irregular verb. A jocular label for what I discovered is technically called emotive or emotional conjugation. Bernard's example is: I have an independent mind, you are eccentric, he is round the twist. We might come up with something like: I implement creative change through strong and effective leadership, you have poor change in personnel management skills, he bullies. All this means, of course, that questions of definition become particularly important. Secondly, bullying is a category which tries to classify and name not so much a specific action, but a pattern of action extended over time. If we say that someone stole from or assaulted me, we are often pointing to one specific, perhaps very brief action or interaction, which stands alone as a one-off. Although it is possible to use the term bullying for one single action, if it's genuinely a one-off, then usually bullying is not an appropriate term. So one long-standing, widely used definition of bullying refers to repeated, deliberate verbal or physical abuse by someone with more power than his or her target. Now, this has some important consequences. By definition, it therefore takes time to realize or discern that bullying is occurring, both for observers and for victims. Given that bullying is wrong, that means that by the time such a moral evaluation is able to be made, wrong has been done for some time and sustained harm already suffered. So 3 further observations building on these. The fact that there is agreement that bullying is wrong means we need to take care in how we use the term. It is not morally neutral. That's why questions of definition are of particular importance. The defense to accusations of bullying is almost always going to be, I wasn't bullying. Definitions are, however, not always easy, especially if we then seek to delineate and distinguish bullying from other categories, such as strong leadership, harassment, manipulation, undue pressure, pastoral or spiritual abuse. We may be attracted to the famous test applied to hardcore pornography by Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. I know it when I see it. However, whatever sympathy we might have for the view that I know bullying when I see it, even more when I'm experiencing it, we do need to seek to develop a wide consensus and an awareness as to what is meant by the term. Fourthly, as in the definition noted earlier, at the heart of any such definition must be issues of power. At the heart of bullying is a combination of power imbalance and abuse of power. So wherever there is an imbalance of power, we need to be aware of the danger of bullying occurring. And to identify bullying, we need to develop an account of the proper use of power. Fifthly, we need not only to define bullying, but address what motivates it. Why do people bully? There are a whole range of reasons. It might be simply to assert, maintain, or increase the imbalance of power through controlling and abusing the relatively powerless. It might be because someone is viewed as of less value because of some characteristic, their sex, race, sexuality, or beliefs. It might be in order to achieve certain outcomes, overcoming opposition to change, silencing disagreement. That forward-looking motivation leads nicely into the second ethical area, the consequences of our actions. And here I want to explore 2 areas in relation to allegations of bullying behavior, one relating to defenses and one relating to accusations. Firstly, as we've noted, few defend as bullying their behavior. The behavior which leads to accusations of bullying is defended normally, if at all, as justifiable actions and necessary to achieve good and important outcomes. A consequentialist ethical argument of the classic form, the end justifies the means. You can't make an omelette without cracking eggs. You can't turn around a big organization headed for the rocks without taking drastic measures, and so on. In church contexts, this gets even more serious as the ends used to justify the behavior normally claim to be part of God's purposes, whether in terms of church growth or effective mission or securing greater holiness or giving respect to church leaders. But God is at least as concerned about our means as he is about our ends. Even if it is accepted that there have been problems, the argument is often then used that these must be kept quiet, as otherwise the consequences, the damage to individual or institutional reputations, or even the gospel itself, are much too great. Which is, of course, often another form of bullying, even if dressed up in legalese as a confidentiality clause in some settlement. Secondly, in relation to accusations, when an accusation of bullying is made, we are being told that among the consequences of the accused person's action was that this person felt bullied by them. That simple fact, in and of itself, must always be a cause of concern and proper investigation, especially given the serious effects of being bullied on people's mental, physical, and spiritual health and well-being, and that the nature of bullying means it will already have taken some time for it to become evident. To fail to investigate properly any accusations of bullying, which was my experience, is a serious but often almost systemic institutional failure that compounds the negative effect of the bullying behavior itself. But this doesn't mean that whenever someone reports bullying, that bullying has indeed taken place. In some cases, the accusation may simply be false and malicious. The paradox is that as we rightly begin to take bullying more seriously, accusations of bullying can themselves, because of their power and potentially damaging consequences for those accused, become part of a form of bullying. In other cases, there may be patterns of bad behavior that need to be addressed, but the language of bullying may be inappropriate. Here again, we return to the challenge of definition. In short, approaching bullying through this lens of consequences highlights the necessity of establishing and using proper and trusted procedures by which concerns about bullying can be raised and properly investigated and effectively addressed. Turning to the third ethical lens, bullying is used not just as a verb for actions, but as an adjective for people. In the 1950s, a parliamentary sketch writer gave the Conservative politician Reginald Manningham Buller the memorable nickname Bullying Manor. Fellow lawyer Lord Devlin wrote of him in a way which illustrates the complexity of bullying, and also how, perhaps particularly among Christians, bullying can be done in more subtle but still powerful ways. Devlin writes of the nickname Bullying Manor, "This was wrong. He was a bully without a bullying manner. His bludgeoning was quiet. He could be downright rude, but he didn't shout or bluster. Yet his disagreeableness was so pervasive, his persistence so interminable, the obstructions he manned so far flung, his objections apparently so insignificant that sooner or later you'd be tempted to ask yourself whether the game was worth the candle. If you ask yourself that, you were finished." Because bullying refers to a pattern of action over time, it inevitably speaks more directly than do certain other failings about the character of the agent. It points to a vice, a habitual pattern of bad behavior, a disposition to respond in certain bad ways to particular people and/or situations. That's one reason why the accusation of bullying is so serious. One can admit one has got drunk even on a number of occasions without thereby admitting one is a drunkard. To admit bullying, in contrast, is to admit something negative about one's character. This points to two further important areas. Bullying in relation to the agent means, firstly, that challenging questions are raised about how we best respond to those who bully. These relate to whether and how there can be transformation of character, not simply greater clarity and enforcement of rules. Connected to this is how, in some cases, the pattern of behavior may be related to psychological or personality disorders, such as narcissism. These are real challenges. We have as a church to be a place of forgiveness, healing, and fresh starts. But many of us will sadly know situations, including in church senior leadership, where someone's leadership style in one context has been experienced as bullying, but they are then appointed to another, perhaps more senior and powerful role, and the same pattern recurs, causing further damage. Secondly, the reality is that the character of a leader shapes the wider culture and ethos of the common life of their community or institution. When the person in charge has a bullying manner, that has damaging effects, not just on those directly subjected to the bullying, but much more widely, including giving license to others to bully. So what, in the light of these ethical reflections, might be said theologically about bullying? Again, this can only be selective. After pointing to theological anthropology, I'll more fully try to sketch out an account centered on Christ and the Spirit with a focus on power to help us to respond to bullying in Christian contexts. As so often in Christian ethics, a key theme must be to unpack and explore the belief that all human beings are made in the image of God and called to be God's image bearers. Set in the context of ancient Near Eastern myths and terminology, this designation in Genesis 1 is radical because it universalizes or democratizes a status elsewhere limited to the ruler, the one with political power. In contrast, the Judeo-Christian tradition, though not without its failings, has come to recognize and defend the inherent dignity, fundamental equality, and intrinsic value of every human being. Alongside that, it has particularly sought to protect the weak and vulnerable. Bullying behavior, particularly when directed against people because they are different and or vulnerable within a wider community, is a denial of this fundamental conviction. It diminishes a fellow divine image bearer and limits or prevents their flourishing and the fulfillment of their call to bear God's image. As Christians, it's Christ as the Son who, in the words of Colossians 1, is the image of the invisible God. And God's purpose, according to Romans 8:28, is to conform us to the image of his Son. Here we find the strongest possible anti-bullying message rooted in Jesus' incarnation, his teaching, and his example. Paul in Philippians 2 famously calls the church to have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And that mindset is the very antithesis of bullying. It is kenotic, it is self-emptying love, seen in the one who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. He humbled himself. Here we see the true path of true divine power, in which the one with the greatest power doesn't use that power to establish, solidify, extend his own power, or to disempower and disregard others. Rather, he empties himself, makes himself nothing, in order to enter the position of the relatively powerless, using his power to serve them and seek their good. And that anti-bullying pattern is what he then calls his disciples to do in their own lives and exercising of power and authority.
3 minutes, Andrew.
In Matthew 20:25 and Mark 10:42, he describes how the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them and says, "Not so with you. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant." The Greek word katakurio speaks of a pattern of behavior with some similarities to what we would call bullying. In 1 Peter 5:3, it's applied to the life of the church, as the shepherds of God's flock are warned about not lording it over those entrusted to you. Philippians 2 continues its account of becoming a servant with the culmination of Jesus' kenotic path. And in the passion accounts of mocking and spitting, we see this path involves being subjected to patterns of bullying behavior. Here, for those Christians who have been bullied, is the comfort that Christ has been there too, in a pretty extreme form. He stands not with the bullies, even if they claim to be acting in his name, but with those who are bullied and abused by those who have more power. Jesus' way, faced with an imbalance of power, is the fulfillment of the vision of the servant in Isaiah 42. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. This is why patterns of leadership, which embody, justify, or turn a blind eye to bullying behavior among Christians, perhaps even on the grounds that it serves God's purposes, are so distorted, even blasphemous. This consequentialist defense highlights one of the core spiritual diseases that underlies bullying among confessing Christians and amounts to denial of the two great feasts we find ourselves between today, Ascension and Pentecost. The Ascension speaks of Christ's rule, the second half of Philippians, confirming that the pattern the Father honors is the kenotic pattern. It reminds all with authority and power in the church that accomplishing God's purposes isn't something which depends on us, and we have no justification for using any means in order to accomplish what we believe are God's purposes. Much bullying within the church stems ultimately from a lack of trust in God and in the reign of Christ over the church and the world. Pentecost, similarly, is the gift to us of God's incomparably great power, which is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realm. Appeals to the Spirit's power can sometimes be a cover for bullying and abusive use of human power. But the key here is that it is the Spirit's power, and that mighty strength is at work on the dead Jesus. The Spirit's power isn't evident in bullying power, however successful that might sometimes appear. The Spirit's power works through those who walk Christ's anti-bullying way of the cross, so that the Spirit's power might be at work even on the powerless dead. As those called to embody the way of Christ, all forms of bullying should therefore be a scandal in the church, never something to be tolerated, perhaps as a necessary evil, or implicitly or explicitly condoned, even celebrated, because they appear to yield to what we might think of as a success. Instead, with Hudson Taylor, we need to cultivate the conviction that it's God's work, done in God's way, the way of Jesus, that will never lack God's supply. And God's greatest supply, of course, is the Spirit. As I close, I want to tie this to the earlier reflections on virtue and character and end on a more positive note. The biblical passage most often linked to virtue is the fruit of the Spirit. All 9 of the virtues are powerful antidotes to a bullying manner, but perhaps none more so than that translated gentleness. And that takes us back to the way of Christ. Some of you may have come across the recent book by Dane Ortland, which opens by pointing out that in the 89 chapters of the 4 Gospels, there's only one place where Jesus tells us about his own heart. That is Matthew 11:29. I am gentle and lowly in heart. And so it shouldn't surprise us that Paul entreats the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 10 by the humility and gentleness of Christ. After describing the Spirit's fruit, he urges Christians caught in transgression be restored in a spirit of gentleness. Timothy is called to instruct his opponents gently and to pursue gentleness. In relation to bullying in the church, yes, we need to work on definitions and establish good processes of investigation and response. But here perhaps is the real antidote, a deeper, positive, Christ and Spirit-centered vision, which we need to make a reality in church life by allowing the Spirit to bear fruit and doing what Colossians 3 urges the church to do: put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Thank you for your patience.